We're going to record this if possible. Okay. You actually have this in a PDF format on your computer. Obviously, if you want to print it, you have a printer at home, you can. But here's what I would do. I would basically, you've got it up on the screen here. I would have a notebook off to my side, and we do not have to get in a hurry on these things. So what I would encourage you to do is, if you don't understand why I'm talking about a particular topic, stop me and say, all right, Chris, I get it. Can you just narrow it down to the important part? And hopefully we can get a lot of mileage doing it that way. Now, having said that, because you guys have gone through Learn, Test, Pass in the past, hopefully you will recognize many of these things that you have seen as you're going over Learn, Test, Pass. What I'm looking for in a review session is aha moments, okay? And then the other thing is, Jackie had mentioned a few weeks back that she didn't understand. I can't remember if it was estates or if it was another topic, but the fact of the matter is, as you have topics that you need clarification on, I normally teach this review in about 6 hours. We have 12 hours allocated for it, and we only have half a dozen people to get it to. So this is going to be, this is literally the whole class in a nutshell is what it amounts to, okay? Now, with that in mind, are you guys ready, or do you have other questions you want to get on the floor before we start?
So,
okay, Jackie, I keep losing you, but Jackie, I'm going to assume that you can hear me okay, unless you tell me otherwise. All right. So let's go ahead and get started.
I have a question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So the Real Estate Commission hasn't changed anything about the testing center being open on the 19th at all?
Well, at this point, it's subject to first come, first serve. So what was happening is the testing center is technically open now, but they had a backlog of people that they had to fill up. And so the first available times were May 19th, the last time I checked. And Jackie, if for some reason you wanted to try to take it quicker, Greenville, North Carolina was actually okay.
I will not be taking it. I will not take it on May 19th either. It's too soon for me. Well, it's not worth me getting sick over. I'm not becoming a broker immediately.
Okay. Well, here's the only thing that I would tell you on that is I would just as soon as I could reserve my spot. And the reason is, if the reason is if you have to push it back, I think you get one free move or something to that effect.
Oh, okay.
He's joining us now. Okay.
Okay.
But no, Jackie, you actually have a 6-month window after you apply. You have a 6-month window in which you can take it. Most people prefer to take it earlier rather than later.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I just didn't feel right about taking it pretty soon.
Cool. All right. Well, let's get started, and hopefully you'll recognize most of these things from when we did the class. So again, stop me, raise your hand, interject if you need to. I'm going to go ahead and turn all of your microphones off for right now, just so that we don't have cross chatter. But the reason I'm turning them off is not because I don't want to hear from you. I just didn't want, if you're doing something private, I didn't want to hear that. So anyway, chime in if necessary. Charles, I know that you're there, but I know that your camera's off, which is absolutely okay. But is there any way you can speak to me, Charles? What did y'all have to click to get audio? Oh, I have you muted. You're going to need to hit the space bar if you want to talk to me. Nikki, what did you have to hit to get audio?
There was a join audio button in the bottom left-hand corner.
Bottom left-hand corner, Charles, if you have that on yours, if you want to join in on audio, go ahead and hit that, okay? Oh, Charles left. I must have made him mad. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, we're going to define what real estate is, and we start off with the concept of land. If I had to tell you what the most important part about land was the fact that you remember land is all-encompassing. It's not just the surface of the earth. It's also air rights. It's also below the surface. And so when you start talking about that, remember some of the topics that we talked about, things like oil and gas rights. You're sitting on them, therefore you own them, therefore they are an appurtenance to the property. And when I talk about something being an appurtenance to the property, it runs with the land. If I choose to sell off my oil rights, I can do that. The problem is later when I go to sell the land, I've already sold off the oil rights from underneath that. Now, having said that, remember how you can extrapolate that into meaning so many more things. Anytime there's something that's appurtenant that's attached to the property, it has value. And if it's removed from the property, then later when you convey the property, it's not there. You would sell the property subject to the appurtenance being gone. Improvements on the property is actually going to be very, very easy. And remember, in the first chapter 2, there was a ton of words. You're only going to get about 4 questions on chapter 2. So it's really not fair. You get so much vocabulary, but you get so little so few test questions off of it. I'm just letting Charles in again. Sorry about that. There you go, Charles. I can see you now. So improvements, anything that's done to make the property more valuable. Now, when we think about improvements, there's your house, there's your fence, there's the driveways that you put in to access the house. In the class, I tried to make I tried to make a comparison between improvements on the land versus improvements to the land. However, you're not going to spend a whole lot of time studying there. Remember, it's only 4 questions. That's not a super high priority. So in reading, I do want you to understand what an improvement is. It's something that was done to the land that makes it more valuable. Improvements on the land, realistically, those are the things that you see when you drive by. Improvements to the land are things that were done to make it more valuable. A road was put in front of the property. The land was cleared so that a house could be put on. These are improvements to the land. Appurtenance is a big deal word. Obviously, it has an asterisk beside it there. Anything that's that a right or privilege that runs with the land is going to be an appurtenance. I've already mentioned a couple of those there. Some are more important than others. And you say, which ones are more important than others? Probably the oil and mineral rights are the most important, because think about how many times they come up in the class. We're mentioning them now with appurtenances, and then also they're addressed in the offer to purchase and contract. So what that means to me is, as I'm studying, hey, how does this relate to a later topic? That's the way I always think when I'm studying for the exam. It's not perfect, but it's not a bad thing to think about. For purposes of the national exam, now what you're going to want to do is you don't need to take an extra note. You can see it has an asterisk beside it here. So I thought that it was important, but this is in vocabulary important. It's not like high level weight importance. On the national exam, they may use the word improvement as an appurtenance here. They may use those words interchangeable. But the way you think about that when you're studying, you just sit there and think about the fact, well, an improvement runs with the land, an appurtenance runs with the land. So from that standpoint, all we're saying is don't let that confuse you if on the exam we use the word improvement where you thought the word appurtenance would have been a better place, or vice versa. Physical characteristics versus economic characteristics. Again, I pointed this out to you in class, but now that we're preparing for the state exam, I just don't have that many questions to ask. So I don't think we're going to beat you up on a cheesy question about these. So here's the way I want you to study these. Just understand why each one is a physical characteristic versus an economic characteristic. So physical characteristic of the land can't be moved. Land is where it is, all right? There is this concept of permanence, meaning that even if you destroy the house that was on it, the land is still there. But if I were going to make a note about anything, here's what I would make the note on. And I did this on day 1 of class, if you remember. The word uniqueness. All land is by definition unique. If for no other reason, it has a different legal description than other land does. So why is uniqueness? Now, this is the relationship back doctrine right here. So land is unique, therefore it gives rise to the concept of specific performance. Do you remember from the contract chapter, remedies for breach of contract? Remedies for breach of contract, I could sue you for money. But if you're the seller and you refuse to act according to the contract, I could sue you for specific performance. Why? Because land is unique. You contracted with me on that land. If you don't sell it to me, I'm going to sue you, and the courts will force you to sell it. So the 2 big words that are important there are uniqueness as a physical characteristic and specific performance. How do they relate together? Make sense? Okay. And then in regards to the economic characteristics, these are just vocabulary words. Scarcity, there's a finite supply of land. Obviously, if something is scarce and a lot of people want it, then it's going to go up in value. If it's we look at certain areas that have been developed and what was once farmland, they didn't create more land, but what changed was the use of it. Because instead of it being used as a farm now, it's used to put 300 condos on. So when we talk about a finite amount of land, yeah, there is a finite amount of land. What changes over time is the way that land is used. Economic characteristics, permanence of investment. Most real estate is purchased for a long-term investment, not a big deal there. And obviously location at this point comes up again in chapter 9, the valuation chapter, why properties are important. That little section right there, uniqueness and specific performance, really, that's the highlight of that little section there, okay? Moving on to personal property, very, very simple here. In this class, there are only two types of property. There is real property and there is personal property. Personal property is pretty much anything that is not real property. Now, here's the big win for you. When you start talking about these items and you say, I can already visualize the test question that's going to come from this. Well, you know good and well the test question about personal property is going to have to do with something like a refrigerator or a washer and dryer. I sell you my house. I told you I was going to give you the refrigerator, but it didn't make it into the offer to purchase. Well, the problem with that is if it's not embodied in a contract of some sort, you're not going to get it. If it was real property, you would automatically get it because it's attached to the house and it would run with the property. But if it's personal property and you want it, you're going to have to ask for it. So technically, while personal property is important here, it actually becomes a test question in the contract chapter. The difference between the way fixtures are treated versus personal property. Good? Okay. Fructus industrialis and fructus naturalis, vocabulary, vocabulary, vocabulary. For those of you who've been doing flashcards, that's all you need on this. Fructus industrialis, crops or implements. You know what? These tests are notorious for asking questions about implements, which I don't know why. I guess because it's a vocabulary word, it's easy to ask a question on. But implements are simply crops in the field, or implements also refers to the right of someone to come back and reap what they have sown. Fructus industrialis, crops, and then what's the real property treatment of crops? Well, the fact is crops are treated as personal property. Now, that may sound confusing, but here's what I mean by that. Notice that if it's a crop in the field, the person who planted it has a right to come back and pick it. So it's just like a refrigerator. From that standpoint, they can take it with them if they want to, okay? You're not going to get a super high level question about implements, but you have to at least know what it relates to. And that's the way I would study the word implements. Fructus naturalis, these are items that are naturally growing in the ground. Your trees, your rose bushes, and they're real property. So they're going to transfer. So a lot of times when you're studying, go back and say, what's the ultimate question that we're looking at here? Everything we're talking about right now is it going to transfer, or will the seller be able to take it with them? Okay, now let's go ahead and just understand you're absolutely going to get a question about fixtures, and it's absolutely going to be a complicated question, but it's probably a level 3 question that you're probably going to get right because we just beat you to death with fixtures. An item that was once personal property, when I bought it at Lowe's or Home Depot, when I bought that ceiling fan at Home Depot or Lowe's, and it was personal property. When I brought it home and I put it up in my bedroom, then it became real property. Once something is attached to the property, it's going to go with the property, okay? If the seller decides to take it, they need to accept it in the contract. So what I want you to study on fixtures, notice what I put here in the underline. I want you to study the contract, but I don't want you to memorize what's in the contract. I want you to look at the items that are in the contract and basically say, oh yeah, I get that. I see why that is a fixture. And here's the rule. If the contract says it's a fixture, then by God, it's a fixture and it's going with the house unless the seller accepts it from there, okay? Now, what's a fixture question going to look like? And fortunately, in your Learn, Test, Pass stuff, you have great questions about fixtures because we know it's going to be there, okay? What's a great fixture question look like? Well, one, it'll say something about the mailbox, but it won't just say the mailbox. It's a mailbox that your kid gave you. But what you did is you took that little mailbox they made in nursery class and you attached it to your house. Well, guess what? You just made it a fixture. It's going with the house. So if you want to keep your little kid's mailbox, you're literally going to have to take it down before you start showing the property and provide another type of mailbox for the house. Okay, they're going to make you think just because it's sentimental, it's not a fixture. If it's attached to that house, it's a fixture. The other thing that they're going to do is they're going to give you something that may be a high price. Okay, I put up an antique chandelier in my dining room. I spent a ton of money on that chandelier thinking I would have it forever. But you know what? When I attached it in that dining room, it became a fixture. So if I didn't either take it down or accept it, it goes with the house. This is the way they try to trick you. And then there's some obvious tricks that they try as well. Tree growing in the yard, fixture. Tree growing in a terracotta planter, not a fixture. And anything you say, seller, anything you put in the contract that you accept is not a fixture either, because you went the extra mile of putting it in the contract and accepting it. Okay. And then finally on fixtures, remember the total circumstances test. Now this is where they try to slide one in every once in a while. I can't promise you that this will come up on the exam, but it used to be a very, very popular question. When I'm trying to determine, when courts technically are trying to determine whether an item is a fixture or not, they apply IRMA, the total circumstances test. What was the intent of the person who attached it? Did they mean for it to be permanent, or did they mean for it to be temporary? What was the relationship to the attacher? Was it an owner who attached it, or was it a tenant? If it was an owner, it's probably a fixture. If it was a tenant, that tenant probably expected that they were going to take it with them when they left. And the method of attachment, did they attach it in such a way as to indicate permanence, or did they just put a couple of 3M stickers on the wall or something to that? And then adaptation, is it so customized for, matter of fact, okay, I did write it on there. Adaptation and customization, is it so customized for this house that it would make sense for it to be nothing but a fixture? I don't know if you remember in class, adaptation, I used the example of a house that had 2-story drapes. You know, drapes are not normally a fixture, but these had custom 2-story drapes for their foyer. You know what? It only made sense for those to be a fixture, okay? And rounding out fixtures, how do you accept a fixture? You write it in the contract and both parties agree. Is a fixture real or personal property? The reason I ask you that question is people start overthinking it. And they'll start thinking, well, Chris said it was once personal property, but it's become real by virtue of its attachment. Well, by the time I describe something as a fixture, it is real property. By definition, at that point, it is real property. Okay, so I'm going to pause and take a breath here for just a second and ask you this question. Everything coming back so far? Everything coming back to you so far? Good, good. This is the way it's going to go for the next several days. We're going to take this in chunks. And if you hear something during that chunk that you need to ask a question about, then that's when we're going to stop and discuss it. Right now, the 2 high-level things that we've seen have been fixtures versus personal property, obviously, and then the concept of uniqueness of real property and specific performance. Feel good? Have you developed some type of strategy for taking notes? Am I moving too quickly, or are we okay? Good, good. Charles says good, so I'm going to let him guide us. Okay. Trade fixtures, not a big deal here, but let's take the easy way out. If it comes up at all, it's going to be a level 1 question. Trade fixtures, okay? They're different from normal fixtures because these are ones that are used for commerce, okay? Trade, they're necessary for the conduct of my business. You see the examples I give you there. I gotta be honest with you. If I were studying trade fixtures, I probably would study nothing other than what's on this table. I wouldn't go back to my notes in my class. I would study just this, because here's the idea of a trade fixture. When I leased my office space, what I got were basically 4 walls. Everything else I put in there and attached, if I ever leave that, because my lease will eventually run out, I can take those with me, assuming that it doesn't do any damage to the shopping center. I can take those with me, and they act almost as if they're personal property. They're trade fixtures necessary for the conduct of my trade. Years ago, we used to ask a question that involved gas tanks, and a lot of people would miss it because they think about gas tanks and they go, oh my gosh, they're so big. How can you take those with you? But people that lease space to put a convenience store, they have big underground gas tanks that they own, or the gas company owns, or somebody. And later, at some point in time, when that's no longer a convenience store, oftentimes they come and take those tanks. Boom, they take them out and they get rid of them. So even gas tanks, if they were purchased for the conduct of that business, then they are considered trade fixtures. On the other hand, if I buy Charles's gas station and Charles owns those underground storage tanks and he sells them to me, well, in that case, they would be real property. So I know gas tanks is a weird one, but if you think about what's the difference? Was I leasing the gas station when I put those gas tanks down? If so, they're not part of the real property. If I bought a gas station that already had those in the ground and owned by the seller, then they'd be real property. Nothing more complicated than that. Nothing more complicated than that. Uniform Commercial Code, an item that appears to be real property will remain the personal property of the financier until it is paid off. Again, it's very much definitional on this case. Well, why is it important? Relate it to something that actually is important. If I go to sell a house, okay? If I go to sell a house and the seller has financed the HVAC unit on it, they bought it from Joe's Heating and Cooling, and Joe provided that service, but he also held the financing on it. Joe is going to fill out what's known as a security agreement and financing statement. Financing statement says you owe Joe money. Security agreement is what he recorded at the Register of Deeds, saying that, hey, if you don't pay me for that HVAC unit, Joe has the right to come back and take that HVAC unit. So the importance of the UCC, Uniform Commercial Code, the importance of that has to do with financed fixtures. If you don't pay the financier, they can't put a lien on the house, but they can come back and take the component that is financed. Now, again, the important part of that is, if you'll remember in the offer to purchase and contract, and you won't remember this, you'll have to go back and look it up. But there's a provision in the offer to purchase and contract where we're asking the seller, hey, do you owe the bank any money? Does anybody else have a lien on your house? Are there any UCC filings that we need to be aware of? Because when the buyer buys that house, he certainly expects the HVAC unit to be there, okay? UCC, an item that was once real property, remains personal property because it specifically was financed. Make sense? Okay, long shot. That's a long shot for a question, okay? Very much important here. We're now talking about the powers of the government. I can't remember in class if I did them in this order or not, but I really like this order for a quick study. When we talk about the powers of government, what we're talking about here are the powers of government in relation to your real property. So we always talk about in the United States, we own property in my name. You can go look at the deed. It says that I own it. Well, that's great, but it doesn't mean the government doesn't own my property, but they have rights within my property. Each one of these you should take as being a study point in and of itself, and just ask yourself, do I understand what that means? So I like the acronym PEAT, Police Powers, Eminent Domain, Taxation, and SG, okay? Nothing significant about the order other than it made a handy little mnemonic device, okay? Police powers, think zoning, and then think to yourself, how does the government affect my property by virtue of zoning? Well, and a simple example of this, I live in an area that is zoned single-family residential. Will I ever get a permit to build a multi-unit apartment building here? No, of course not, because the government can dictate what I can put on this property, and I would literally never get a permit if it was something for which it was not zoned for. Does that make sense? Okay, so when you think police powers, think zoning, building codes. Why are zoning and building codes considered to be legitimate? For the health, safety, welfare of the community. For health purposes. Zoning, we don't want too many people living right on top of each other because you need the infrastructure to take care of waste and sewage and stuff like that. And also in safety, building codes, you know, we don't want houses falling apart on top of people. Those are the police powers of the state. It has nothing to do with the way you think of police. It has to do with the powers of the state. Eminent domain. Now, eminent domain, very, very popular test topic from it could come up on the state or the national because it's defined the same either way. So in regards to eminent domain, it's the right of the government to take private property for public use by offering just compensation. Bam, that's it. If you know what each one of those words mean, you're done with eminent domain. Taking private property, hey, it's my property, but the government can take it from me Well, not for any reason, though. It has to be for a public use, and then they have to pay me for the money. Don't get into arguments at this point about what just compensation is. It's just a definition for us. In reality, this is a much more heated topic, but on the exam, it's fairly straightforward. Okay, one high-level comment here, one high-level comment. Some test will test you on the fact that the difference between police powers and eminent domain is that under eminent domain, if the government's going to take your property, they have to compensate you for it. But under police powers, if the municipality downzones your property such that you lose value on your property, they don't owe you any money. For actions of the police power, the citizen doesn't get compensated. For acts of eminent domain, you're always entitled to reasonable compensation. Got it? Definition, comparison, move on, okay? With eminent domain, notice I gave you some examples of what it might be used for. So it might be instructive to kind of keep that in mind. I think it's straightforward. Taxation, this would almost have to be tested on the state side, if at all, because taxation is different all over the country. So here's what we do in North Carolina. So as you look at each one of these topics, you simply ask yourself, do I know what that means? If you know what it means, you don't have to study it, okay? So for example, I look at the first word, ad valorem. It just means according to the value. So when I look at that, what it means to me is that you are taxed based on the value of your property, right? And we're talking about real property taxes. So you're taxed on the value of your property. If you ever look at your tax card, it says your house is worth $300,000 and your tax rate is 65 cents per 100 or something to that effect. You're taxed on the assessed value of the property. One point here, and I made this on day one in class, so I'm not going to beat you up about it now. This is just a reminder. Remember, you're always taxed on your assessed value. You're not taxed on your market value. You're not taxed on the sale price. You're not taxed on the appraised value. You are taxed on the assessed value, okay? Also remember the North Carolina formula. Assessed value divided by 100 times the tax rate, okay? So potential test question, math question there, excuse me, which we will do a little bit later in the review. We'll go over the math review. But that's the formula for North Carolina. Now, one note here, I'm going to give it to you because I don't know if it comes up anywhere else. I don't know if you remember me talking about the concept of a mill rate, an M-I-L-L, a mill rate. But what I told you on the day that we went over the mill rate was don't let that confuse you. In North Carolina, we don't use one. In your mind, I just want you to associate the word mill with divide by 1,000. The way I said it in class was if you ever see a question about mill rate, instead of dividing by 100, I'm pointing at my screen as if y'all can see me pointing at my screen. Instead of dividing by 100, if you see a mill rate, well, you would divide by 1,000. That's what some states do, okay? To you, definition related to taxes, divide by 1,000. Then we're back to North Carolina again with this bullet point right here. Taxes become a lien on real property as of September 1st, as of January 1st of the tax year. That's when they become a lien on the property. Taxes are always due September 1st. Taxes are considered late the following January 5th. So this is a timeline. You just want to draw this out and make sure you understand it. Hey, they were a lien against your property before you ever got the tax bill because it was last January 1st. That's when they became a lien on your property, even though they're not due till September 1st. And in class, I told you very few people pay them on September 1st. And the reason very few people pay them on September 1st is because they're not considered late until the following January 5th. That's when you're given a penalty and interest on those, okay? All that sound familiar to you? It's just reminders, okay? List taxes month in January, blah, blah, blah. No big deal, no big deal. Taxes are considered, this is a vocabulary word. This is the type of stuff we pick up in going over tests is when we look at the PSI test and stuff like that. We don't actually look at the actual PSI test. We look at things that they put out in relationship to that test. And so from a vocabulary standpoint, they use things that we don't always use in class. Taxes are considered an involuntary lien. Why are they considered involuntary lien? Well, look, this is not in a contract that I went out and entered into. The city and the county put a lien on my property. because I owe them tax money. Okay, so that's why it's involuntary lien. And then finally, the Machinery Act. I think we're getting away from cheesy questions about the Machinery Act. We used to ask questions about the Machinery Act because remember we had a lot of laws that start with the letter M. And so we had the Machinery Act, we have the Marketable Title Act, we have a Mechanics Lien. Having said that, Machinery Act, that's the North Carolina law that relates to taxes. So Machinery Act related to real property taxes, you're probably done if you can make that much. We are taxed on a local basis, but the state has a law that tells municipalities, hey, municipalities, follow all these other rules that we gave you right here, but go collect as much money as you want to locally, but do it according to the guidance of the Machinery Act. And then finally, escheat. Remember, police powers, eminent domain, taxation, and escheat. Escheat is just simply the state is your final heir. What does that mean? Now be careful on this one. Be careful on escheat. If we throw you a softball question, I want to make sure you don't miss it. When I die, if I own real property, my real property is most likely going to go to whoever I left it to in a deed. Whoever I left it to in a will. Now keep in mind, if I'm married, it doesn't matter. If I own property as tenancy by the entirety, my real property is going to go to my surviving spouse. So surviving spouse or whoever I left it to in a will. Now, if I don't have a will, my estate will go to my heirs. So if I don't have a will, it's going to go to my heirs. If I had a will, it's going to go to my devisees. If I don't have a will, it's going to go to my heirs. If I don't have a will and I do not have heirs, and I have made no other stipulations about my property, how it's going to be dispersed at my death, then it's going to go to the state of North Carolina, and that process is known as escheat. Okay, escheat is a very specific word, and it refers when property goes to the state. In this case, if you die without a will and without heirs. So just be careful on that word, and you're going to be in good shape. Okay. So that's your little introduction there to the powers of the government: police power, eminent domain, taxation, and escheat. All of that fairly straightforward so far? Okay, nice handy little chunk. I dare say it's getting ready to get a little more serious at this point, because now we're getting into the Freehold Estates. And here's absolutely what's not fair about the Freehold Estates. These are very hard to understand, and you're only likely to get one test question out of it. So, you know, it's one of those type things you're like, crap, I'm studying so hard to understand this, and it's only worth 1 point. But you know what? It's a point that you can't just give away. So you try to understand these. Don't become an attorney, but try to understand these. Jackie, I still cannot see your face, but I know you're there. I think estates was something you had questions on. So if you need me to stop at any point, just raise your hand, and you're certainly welcome to chime in at any point. You guys have done real well about not chiming in for no reason at this point. So let's get started on the Freehold Estates. Now, when we talk about the Freehold Estates, here's what I think. I think of the word freehold as meaning I own it, okay? Now, it's kind of a minimal way of saying I own it. What I mean by a minimal way is we're now going to break that down into different ways we might hold title to that property. But the word freehold, for our purposes, means you own it. I know the book says that estates for at least a lifetime, which is true, but they're ownership estates, okay? Then I told you within the Freehold Estates, there is a hierarchy, and I actually like the way they're listed here because it really shows you that hierarchy. Some estates are better than others. And when I say some estates are better than others, remember, I have a specific definition of what I mean by better than others. What I mean by is, do you own them and can you leave them to your heirs? So at the top of my list of what's important is, do you own it and is it inheritable? Okay. So moving down from that, the greatest estate of ownership in real property is the fee simple absolute. And using my definition, what makes it the greatest estate of ownership? Well, what makes it the greatest estate of ownership is that not only do I own it, but I can leave it to my heirs without condition. Okay. Now here comes the trick question. Here comes the trick question. Notice I said I can leave it to my heirs without condition. I did not say I can leave it to my heirs without encumbrance. If I were to die tomorrow, I would die with a mortgage on my property. Well, guess what? My estate, my heirs are going to be responsible for that if they choose to accept the property. okay? So don't think that when I say it's without condition, it could be eat up with encroachments, encumbrances, mortgages, whatever. We're not talking about the quality of the title. We're talking about the longevity of the title. Fee, simple, absolute, the greatest estate of real property. Why? Because I can leave it to my heirs without condition, okay? I do want to bring one other word here, and I've got all these in the notes, but just as a reminder, the word fee means inheritability. If you ever see the word fee involving an estate, it means I can leave it to my heirs or whoever I choose to leave it to for that matter, okay? At the end of the day, fee simple absolute is not that difficult. What gets difficult is when you start comparing these other estates to them. But again, you're not playing attorney here. What you're doing is you're just trying to recognize the differences. What makes these less desirable? The defeasible fee estates. I often use in class, the word defeasible looks to me like the word defeat. And the defeasible fee estates have a condition which, if broken, may result in reversion. So in other words, if the condition is defeated, if the condition is broken, then it could result in reversion. Reversion is also a key word here. Now, I'm telling you, don't go study Black's Law definitions or whatever it's called. Here, I want you to remember the story that I told you in class about a defeasible fee estate. It had to do with a property. I own property in Kinston, 40 acres in Kinston. I deed it to my church. I literally deed it to my church so that they can build a church facility on it. But in the deed, I actually had it stated that the church will own it as long as they use it for church purposes. And do you remember I gave you an example? If Walmart came along and tried to buy that property from them, they'd never be able to sell it to them. Because if they break the condition, it's going to revert back to me, the grantor. It doesn't mean that I still own the property. It just means if they break the condition, it's going to come back to me. Now compare that to the fee simple absolute. Fee simple absolute had no conditions, right? The defeasible fee estate does have conditions. So what I tell people is that if anyone ever gave me a defeasible fee estate, I'd take it. I just wouldn't break the condition. Because if I took it and I didn't break the condition, could I leave it to my heirs? Well, look, it's a fee estate. So as long as the condition is not broken, now I know the example I gave, the church is not going to die, so that wouldn't apply to that. But if I had literally given it to an individual with a condition in it, as long as the condition is not broken, they could leave it to their heirs forever until they either sell it or break the condition. Defeasible fee estates technically tested as a level 1, all right? Which means if you understood the example I gave you about the church, you're probably in pretty good shape. Now, I've had people, and I actually teach this in class, that break the defeasible fee estates down into 2 categories. Fee simple determinables. Fee simple determinables, what I want you to concentrate on is the word automatically. The example I gave you about the church was a fee simple determinable. Why? Because if the condition was broken, it automatically reverts back to the grantor, the person who created the deed to start with. Whereas a fee simple condition, the conditional, it's based on some future use of the property. And so the reversion is not automatic, but the example I gave you on the fee simple conditional had to do with a hog farm where I sold property to someone. I said, look, just don't put a hog farm on it. You can do whatever you want to on this property, but don't put a hog farm on it because I live next door to this. Okay. Well, problem is if they ever do decide to put a hog farm on that property, it doesn't automatically revert to me. I have to go back and sue them to get the property back. Now, these are complicated topics that I want you to uncomplicate. Why are these less desirable than a fee simple absolute? It's because they have a condition. What happens if the condition is broken? It's going to revert back to the original grantor. Determinable, it'll automatically do it. Conditional, you're going to have to sue somebody to get your property back. Now, here's where this deteriorates. If you start thinking too much, this gets out of control. Because a lot of people say, well, wait a minute. When it reverts back, is there any money that exchanges hands? Do I have to pay them anything? Blah, blah, blah. I don't know. I mean, that's law school stuff. We don't need to worry about that. Do you understand why it's less desirable than an absolute? Do you understand the concept of reversion reverts back to the original grantor? and just memorize. Determinable, it automatically reverts back. Conditional, you're gonna have to sue somebody to get your property back. Okay, Jackie, how are we doing so far, Jackie? I'm unmuting you. I'm gonna try to unmute you. You got a lot of mic, Jackie. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Are we getting close to the things that you had questions about?
I didn't really have questions. I just wanted to go over it because I couldn't remember. So this was helpful.
Okay, good. I want to make sure that I'm on point on what it was you're looking for. Now, it's about to get weird again, but I'm going to mute you, and then you're welcome to chime back in if you want further explanation. So now I'm moving on to the life estate pro V. Now, here's what's weird about the life estate pro V. Look, let me tell you something. If you try to understand this, you're just going to mess up. Okay, you have to literally say, well, what's Chris going to test me on? I want you to notice that a life estate pro V is a freehold estate, which means what I'm getting ready to describe to you means that somebody owns this property, okay? And it's a fee estate because it's inheritable. It doesn't use the word fee, but it's under the category of inheritable, which means that they can leave it to their heirs if they can leave to their heirs what it is they own. If you will remember on the board, and if you want to draw this out while you're right there, you should have this in your notes from the day that we went over. I described a pro V as being A, granting the property to B. So A grants the property to B, so B therefore owns it, correct? B only owns it as long as C is alive. And then when C dies, it's going to go to D. Okay, do y'all remember that drawing on the board? Okay, good. Now here's where it gets a little bit tricky. A conveyed the property to B. B therefore owns it, which means if it's an inheritable estate, if B dies, it's going to go to B's heirs. Now the fun thing about this when we're talking about it in class is there has never been a pro V set up believing that B was going to die before C. The example I gave you in class was A and C were an elderly couple. And so A was getting ready to die. And so they wanted to leave the property to his wife, C, but she had diminished legal capacity. So he had to leave it to her son by her first marriage, B, which he didn't like him, but he took good care of his mom. So A to B, B owns it for the life of C. B one day is pulling out of his driveway, gets hit by a Mack truck, bam, he's dead. And so now all of a sudden, who's the property go to? Well, it can't go to C. All she was the measuring life. It can't go to D because he's not going to own it until C dies. So it's going to go to B's heirs. And they will own it, and they will have a right to leave it to their heirs as long as C is alive. A pro V is, first of all, weird. Okay, I can't imagine any attorney today recommending that somebody do this. It's hard to follow. And the point that you're asking yourself is, why are we studying it? The reason we're studying it is a pro V a freehold estate? Yeah, B owns it. He's not renting it, so B does own it. Is it inheritable? Freakishly enough, it is inheritable, because if B were to predecease C, it would go to his heirs. So when you break down a pro V, all you're trying to do in your mind is just simply say, is it freehold and is it inheritable? And the answer to both those questions turns out to be yes. Okay, fun to talk about, but when it's time to study, just get down to the nuts and bolts. Is it freehold? Is it inheritable? Yes, yes. Okay. Now we're not through with estates. And the reason we're not through with estates is we have to go now from estates that are freehold, but not inheritable. Here's some good news for you. That's a category of one, okay? Conventional life estates, which may be referred to as traditional life estates. If you ever see me talk about a life estate, I'm talking about this topic right here. In other words, a life estate pro V is always called a life estate pro V. Traditional life estates are sometimes just referred to as life estates. These you will see. I actually told you in class, we had one of these in our family. When my dad died, he left his property to his wife, who was not my mother. And so he left the property to her as long as she lived. But at her death, he didn't want it to go to her kids. He wanted it to come to his kids, okay? So he said, A, my dad, to B, my stepmom, for her life, but she could not choose her heirs. He had already picked who it was going to go to at her death. and had it written in the will, she knew exactly what she was getting at his death, okay? So she owned it for her life. At her death, it would come to his kids, okay? It's the way he had it set up. Now, again, let's apply what we know we're going to be tested on. Is a life estate a freehold estate? Yeah, she owns it. Is it an inheritable estate? No, she can't choose who it goes to, okay? So it's not inheritable. That's the important question. Now, there are some ancillary questions that go along with this that are somewhat important as well. And look, I've given you a kind of a reminder on here as well. Do you understand what I mean by the word life tenant? In this example, my stepmother was the life tenant. She owns it for her life. Don't let the word tenant confuse you. Remainder or reversion. In this case, I am the remainder man because I'm the one who's ultimately going to get it at her death. Having said that, if Dad had simply said from him to her for life, it would actually revert either back to him or whoever's standing in his shoes. You'll see the word reversion come up in 3 possible circumstances. You've already seen reversion in regards to the feasible fee estates. You see reversion come up now in regards to life estates, and you'll also see reversion come up when we start talking about tenancies as well. In other words, in a tenancy, if I lease you my property for a year, when you move out, it reverts back to the original owner. Okay. The most important one on this list, though, are the rights of a life tenant. Historically, this is where we have tested you. But there's only one thing you need to remember. On day 1 in class, I usually make this comment, and I tell people, I say, if you can understand why this comment is so important, it's going to help you on multiple questions throughout the test. If you own real property, you have the right to convey the property. Remember, I never said that you had the ability to do it. I said you had the right to do it. So let's go back to my stepmom. As long as she is alive and she owns a life tenancy, does she have a right to sell that property? Yeah, she has a right to. I don't know if anybody's going to buy it from her, but she has a right to. She's old and in bad health. If somebody bought it from her and then she died tomorrow, they'd have to give it to the remainder person. So yeah, she has the legal right to sell it, okay? Does she have the right to use it as collateral for a debt? Sure she does, but I don't know what bank's going to give her any money off of it, okay? So rights of a life tenant. They have a right to use the property. They have a right to convey their interest in the property, but not greater than what they own. They have the right to use it as collateral for a debt. Good luck with that. And then the word estovers versus an active waste. Look, let me tell you something. We're really getting out there when we talk about these words, but they're vocabulary words and they're level 1. So go ahead and just memorize them so you'll know what they relate to. The word estovers refers to this. You can use the property to repair the property. The example that they always use is if you own a property that had tall standing timber, you could cut down the timber to repair the house. What you could not do, what the life tenant cannot do, is they cannot cut down the timber and sell it to the pulp company to make whatever wood products or whatever out of. Because what they're doing is they're reducing the value of the property if they just go out and sell off the timber. But if they use that timber to repair the house, that's okay. Okay. Estovers, you have a right to use the property to repair the property. Active waste would be selling off part of the property. A life tenant has to maintain the value of the property. They don't have to improve it. They just can't allow it to deteriorate. Okay. Conventional life estate, freehold, but not inheritable, and rights of a life tenant. Okay. And then finally, marital life estates, for test purposes, not going to be a big deal. If you're ever dealing with a married couple trying to sell a property, you're going to need both signatures. And here's why. If they're married, they most likely own the property as tenants by the entirety. But even if they don't, the non-titled spouse will likely have a marital right in the property. Marital life estates, you don't own anything. I don't know if you remember in class, I referred to these as death rights. Okay. So in other words, if my spouse dies and didn't put me in the will, then I will get certain protections by the state of North Carolina. Okay. All right. That was a little chunk, but it was important information. But here's good news. There's only going to be one test question on it. And my guess is, if anything, they're going to test you about, is it freehold? is it inheritable, and then maybe just a couple of little definitional things. Okay. So how do you feel about freehold estates? Do you have the ability to go back and study those and make sense out of them? Okay. All right. I'm going to open up your mics for just a minute here. I've been talking for an hour. So I'm going to open up your mics, and you can say anything that you want to. Among the things that you might want to say is, if we're going too fast, let me know. If you're going too slow, let me know. If you need to take a break and go to the restroom, let me know. Okay, all right. So let's take about a 5-minute break, just so that you can go grab something to freshen up with. I'm going to take 5 minutes, so I'm going to be back at 10:08. I'm going to leave your mics open. You can close them if you want to. And then feel free to talk to each other, or when I'm back at 10:08, feel free to ask me questions, and I'll address those as we go through our study. Okay?
That was just dirt. That was like, yeah, I think it was like Leroy. Show me then, because no. we're taking a 5-minute break. Oh, I know what you're talking about. Yes.
All right, I am back. So if anybody has any specific questions before we get started back in the breakdown. And it's nice outside today on some of my CE classes. I noticed that around 10 o'clock, people start going outside to listen to the class on their decks and porches and stuff. It's kind of cool. And so I will pick up, and while we're picking up, again, I'm opening up the floor for you guys. Any comments, questions, clarification? Anything? All right, then this is going better than what I thought it would. We're going to be done with this today if we keep on at this pace. Actually, no, we won't. I mean, it's clearly going to take 6 hours to go through the whole class like this. We're still at the start of chapter 2. So bear with me, but remember, it's always open for those things that I meant, comments, clarifications, etc. Okay, moving on ever so slightly. Now, here's some good news about this next little topic. It actually knocks out part of chapter 2, but it also knocks out the chapter on landlord-tenant as well. So because it comes up here in my notes, I'm going to go ahead and deal with it. And I'm going to remind you, it's test time now, okay? So I'm not going to give you the extravagant explanations that I gave you in class. I'm going to tell you this. When we talk about these estates, these are non-freehold. Another word for non-freehold is leasehold, meaning you do not own it. You just have a right to possess it, control it for a period of time. And so when we talk about these estates, what I want you to do is understand an essential characteristic of each one of these estates. So for example, when we talk about estate for years, that's probably the one that people have the most trouble with, and here's why. We call it an estate for years, but it has nothing to do with years. It could be years, it could be a week, it could be a month, whatever. But the key to it is simply that it's any fixed term lease. The reason I use the week example is most of your vacation rentals are actually an estate for years. Why do I say that? Because on a vacation rental, you come in at Sunday at 3 o'clock. The next Sunday, you have to be gone at 11 o'clock. There are no rights of renewal. It is a fixed, F-I-X-E-D, a fixed term lease. And that's the essential characteristic. Years ago, we used to have a test question, and it would look something like this. You have signed a lease for 45 days with no rights of renewal. You just have to be gone on the 45th day. This is an example of, and the answer was an estate for years. Sometimes these could be referred to as a tenancy for years as well. On each of these, we could swap the word estate for tenancy, and it would be fine. Fixed term lease. Let me give you something to compare it to. When we talk about the estate from year to year, the next bullet point there, these are sometimes referred to as your periodic tenancies. So in other words, I could replace the word year to year with month to month, week to week, period to period, okay? Essential characteristic. These are technically estates of unlimited duration or undefined duration, you may want to say, indefinite term. There you go, I actually use that in the verbiage there. Why? Well, you look at it and you say, well, Chris, it's year to year. So isn't it just 12 months? Well, the fact of the matter is, think back to when you rented an apartment. When you rented an apartment, you may have had a 12-month lease, but if you did not give notice, it automatically renewed. So that's an example of an estate from period to period, okay, a periodic tenancy. Again, what you're doing is you're noticing the difference between the two. Estate for years, automatic termination. Estate from year to year, if you don't give notice, it's going to keep going, right? Now, there is a question, and I don't know how much we have limited number of questions we can ask you on this. However, you may want to go back and take a look at this in your notes. If there is a notice that is necessary, you may want to look at what the minimum notice required to vacate is. And it's based on the term of the lease. For example, if it's a week-to-week lease, minimally, you have to give 2 days notice if you want to vacate. If it's a month-to-month lease, you have to give 1 week notice. If it's a year-to-year lease, you'd have to give 1 month notice. Really the big thing that I want you to see when you go back and study those, because this is such a level 1 topic, and I don't want you memorizing just to put clutter in your minds. Notice when we talk about the minimum notice to vacate, the period of notice is within, it's less than the period. So notice when I said it was week to week, well, that's only a couple of days notice. Okay. If it's month to month, well, that's 1 week notice. And if it's year to year, minimally a month. Now, remember, these can be changed by contracts. So when you may be thinking to yourself right now, well, when I had an apartment lease, I had to give 60 days notice. Well, yeah, that's fine, because it was a 30-day minimum notice, a 1 month minimum. You could agree by contract for it to be as much as whatever you wanted to, whatever the landlord wanted. Estate at will, think house sitting. Remember the stories I told you about estate at will. I got to be honest with you. Here's what I think the important part of an estate at will is. I need you to understand the difference between someone getting on a property legally versus someone trespassing on a property. And the big difference is how you get rid of that person. If someone is on your property legally and you want to get rid of them, in other words, if they're staying on your property legally, whether you have a lease agreement with them or not, in this case, house sitting, I let someone stay at my house for several months while I was on sabbatical. Well, they got there legally. If they don't leave, then I'm going to have to evict them. There's only one way to get rid of someone who has established residency on your property. In North Carolina, you have to evict them if they don't voluntarily leave. Whereas if it's a trespasser, you could simply have the sheriff come and escort them off your property immediately. Okay, that actually is where I'm kind of going with that. Which brings us, by the way, to the last estate, last of the non-freehold estates. Got to be honest with you, it's really not as much as an estate as it is a condition. Estate at sufferance means you're a holdover tenant. I probably should have had the word holdover tenant underlined in that case. You have stayed beyond your welcome. All right. And typically when people are at estate at sufferance, they're in the process of being kicked out. But remember, kicking someone out is a process. It's going to take, you have to give them notice. You're going to have to take them to court. You're going to have to wait for the sheriff to come out and remove them. So there is a process because they got there illegally. So you're going to take these little chunks right here, non-freehold estates. Do you own it? Nope, because it's not a freehold estate. But what rights do you have? Well, you have the right to possess it, and you have the right to control it as long as you're within the terms of your lease. Not a big deal. Vocabulary, compare to each other. Was there a comment? Okay. If not, I'm going to move on. Slightly more important here, we're now talking about how people can hold title to property. Mostly vocabulary, but then let's fill in the terms around it to make sure we're okay. All right. Remember, when we're talking about owning property, if we ever say someone owns property in severalty, it means that they have severed themselves from everyone else. There's only one name on the deed. If you own property in severalty, there's only one name on the deed. Okay. If I wanted to ask you a tricky question, it would go along these lines. If I own property in severalty, but I'm married, does my wife own any of the property? The answer is no. She doesn't own any of the property, but she has a marital right. Unless we've done some other type of court action, she has a marital right, okay? If I own property in severalty and then I get married, does my new spouse own any of the property? Nope, but she has a marital right in the property. Now, I do want to slow down here for just a moment because although what I'm saying right now is not extraordinarily important, the concept is extraordinarily important. Do you remember that this test is really big on what happens when someone gets married, when someone dies, and in some cases when someone sells? So you always want to ask yourself about these. Okay, well, what happens if they get married? What happens if someone dies? Okay, if I own property in severalty and I get married, nothing happens except my spouse now has a marital interest in the property. She doesn't own anything. Let's move on to tenancy in common. Tenancy in common is the default for unmarried persons acquiring property in North Carolina. Okay, key there being unmarried persons acquiring property. Okay, so if me and any other person other than my wife, buy property together and we don't state otherwise in the deed, Now, keep in mind here, we didn't state otherwise in the deed. I know when multiple people buy property together, they often create things like LLCs and corporations, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about unmarried persons buying property together. They don't state otherwise in the deed. They're going to hold property as tenants by a tenancy in common, excuse me. Now, in regards to tenancy in common, it's very, very flexible here. So let me give you a very common case where people may own property as tenancy in common. Myself and my fiance, now keep in mind, we're not married, so we don't own property as tenancy entirety, but myself and my fiance, we buy a property together. We don't tell the attorney what to put in the deed. So what he does is he creates it to me and my fiance. We are tenants in common. We're 50-50. Why are we 50-50? Well, because we didn't express otherwise in the deed. So the court's just determined that we meant for it to be 50-50. If for some reason my fiance ever wants to sell her share, she can sell to anybody she wants to. And that person will now own stake in her property up to 50%. She can't sell mine without my signature, but she could certainly sell her interest in the property. Tenancy in common, very flexible. People come in and out all the time. Now, in tenancy in common, my fiance and I own the property as tenancy in common. If I die, well, my property's not going to go to her unless I left it to her in the will. I'm not married to her, so she's not an heir. If I don't have a will, it's not going to it. It's going to go to whoever my natural heirs are or whoever I left it in the will. But we own it 50-50, so my 50% will go somewhere else. If I die, same thing would happen to her if she died, and that new person would come along as a tenant in common, okay? Remember, tenant in common, because it is very flexible, people can move in and out of it all the time. You can share your interest to anybody you want to, unless there's some agreement to the contrary, which there's not going to be in this class, okay? What else? Oh, the other thing about tenancy in common is I don't own a specific 50%. I own a 50% interest in the whole, okay? Trying to think of anything else that comes up there. All right, tenancy in common. My fiance and I own property as tenancy in common. What's going to happen when I get married? When we get married, we're still going to own property as tenancy in common. If she comes to me one day and says, Chris, this doesn't make sense. Now that we're married, we need to own property in a different manner. Well, we can deed that property from ourselves to ourselves as a now married couple, and we could own it as tenancy by the entirety. But nothing actually changed when we got married. Nothing changes in ownership without taking a proactive step on that. So tenancy in common, how do you hold it? What rights do you have? What happens if you get married? What happens if you die? Okay. Questions or comments on tenancy in common? You feel okay about that? I don't know if you remember, but in class, what I did, and I'm going to do the same thing right now, is I told you tenancy in common was the default for unmarried persons acquiring property together. And in class, I then skipped to tenancy by the entirety. And the reason was it's the default for married persons acquiring property while married. Now, again, go back to your Learn, Test, Pass and take a look at the questions we ask here and have an aha moment on this. See, in regards to tenancy by the entirety, I've already told you one of the questions. My fiance and I bought a house together. Well, we didn't say how we're going to hold title, and we weren't married yet, so it's tenancy in common. When we got married, we still own it as tenancy in common. If we would like to own it as tenancy by the entirety, we have to deed it from ourselves to ourselves. Why? Because there has to be the 5 unities, and I've listed all of them here. Marriage, possession, interest, time, and title. Well, the reason we couldn't hold it as tenancy by the entirety to start with was because we weren't married. But now that we're married, we could deed it from ourselves to ourselves as a married couple with the same amount of possession, interest, time, and title. We're on the same deed at the same time, and we each have equal possession of the property. We're no longer 50-50. Tenancy by the entirety is based on the legal assumption that a married couple is no longer 2 people, it's 1 entity, okay? So marriage, possession, interest, time, and title. Now, here's what's interesting about tenancy by the entirety. What happens when we get ready to sell or die? Well, if I get ready to sell property I own as tenancy by the entirety, I absolutely have to have my spouse's signature because she is much owner as I am. Okay, it's impossible for me to transfer it without her signature. Okay, and then what's going to happen when I die? Remember, tenancy by the entirety includes the automatic right of survivorship. Now, I need you to focus on this word. This question is missed so much by students, and I understand why, but at the same time, I don't understand why. because I'm telling you that it's going to be important. So here's what I mean by this. Anytime you see the word survivorship, please understand that that's going to your surviving partner. In this case, because it's tenancy by the entirety, my surviving partner will be my wife. Okay, so it goes to her. She's not my heir, she's my survivor. People on the test confuse heirs with survivors. So that's the tip I'm going to give you on that. Okay, so I have to have her signature to sell it. If I die, it's automatically going to her. What else is important by tenancy by the entirety? I mentioned the 5 unities. I think that's probably a good breakdown of that. So now let me go back to the one that I skipped. Okay, joint tenancy. Now notice what I put here. Joint tenancy allows for survivorship outside of the marital entity, which brings up 2 potential questions. One, tenancy in common does not have survivorship. So if you want survivorship in North Carolina, you got 2 choices. You can marry the person you want to be your survivor, or you could enter into joint tenancy, because tenancy in common doesn't allow for it. So the examples I give in class are something like this. Do you remember earlier when I said I was engaged but not yet married? Well, if my fiance and I buy a house together, it would probably be good advice for us to hold title as joint tenants. That way, if one of us died before we actually got married, the surviving partner would automatically get the other piece of the property. Okay. I also gave examples of not only unmarried couples, sometimes brothers and sisters hold property this way. So the property's left to 3 brothers and sisters, with the understanding that as each one dies, the remaining survivors get the property. That way, when the last one's standing, they tried to keep the property in the family, so to speak. Okay. Ownership in real property, severalty, just one. Tenancy in common, default for unmarried. Tenancy by the entirety, the default for married couples buying property together while they're married. And then joint tenancy, it allows for survivorship outside of the marital entity. What happens when you get married? What happens when you die? That is a very tight little package to study on ownership of real property. Okay, maybe good for 1 point. Questions or comments on that? Okay. Getting into these other forms of ownership, and in class, when we were coming through these in class, the reason these all come together is they're based on the idea of how multiple people can hold title together. So when we talk about condominium, we're not really talking about the condominium building. We're talking about the condominium ownership style. And here's what the condominium ownership means. If you own a condominium, what you technically own is airspace within a unit. Picture it looks like an apartment building, but you actually own a unit. But what you own is the airspace within the unit, and then you're a tenancy in common in the common area. So that's the definition of a condominium. So what that means is a couple of things. One, yes, I do own real property. Condominium ownership is, in fact, real property. I can sell it to you just like I can anything else. I can hold it in severalty. I could hold it as a tenant in common. I could hold it as a tenancy by the entirety. I mean, it is real property, okay? But the other thing that it means is pretty much everything other than the airspace within my unit and my percentage share of the common areas, pretty much everything else is common areas. The exterior walls, common area. The halls, common area. The stairs, common areas. The roofs, the siding, all of that are going to be common area and commonly maintained by the condominium association. Here's another one of those words. Notice it has an asterisk beside it, which means we've picked this up from just talking to people about what's being tested on. Watch out for this word on the exam. In talking about a condominium, you may hear something described as a limited common element, which means it is common area. However, it's limited to one party. The best definition, and I did not write it here, so you're going to want to make a note on this, limited, and I'm sure you have this in your notes as well. Limited common elements would include things like assigned parking. Now remember, you are already a tenant in common in the parking area, right? But what the complex has done is just simply said, but you park there in space 52. Limited common elements would also include things like assigned storage, okay? You use that storage unit as part of the common area, but we're giving you that one. And then one that we have found out comes up on the exam is balconies. I never really thought about this before, but balconies are actually outside of your condominium unit, so they would not meet the definition of airspace. But think about it. It's a limited common element because nobody can use my balcony but me, because I'm the only one that can get there without having to go through my apartment. So it's limited to my personal use, even though technically it's commonly maintained. These next 2 bullet points are actually specific to North Carolina, and I got to be honest with you, I don't think they're a big deal. I don't believe that they're a big deal. The Condominium Act of 1981, or whenever it was, when purchasing a new residential condominium, and I want you to notice here so that you don't have to take any notes on it, the buyer has a 7-day absolute right of rescission when buying a what? New residential condominium, okay? And the reason that this is important at all is to help you as an agent understand, hey, look, unless there is some provision or some law that gives you the right to walk away from a contract. In North Carolina, when you're under contract, you're under contract. Now, when you buy a new condominium, there's a law that says, well, you have a 7-day right to rescind if you choose to do that, okay? And then on condominiums, if you're selling a resale, there's just simply a resale certificate, but don't get bogged down in the resale certificate. They're not as fancy as what they sound like, but what they're designed to do is explain to the buyer what their ongoing costs are going to be. So you know you're going to pay condominium fees. If there's special assessments, you're going to have to pay those. Also, there's going to be some description of who manages the property and has a right to decide when to spend money, stuff like that. Okay, what do I want you to remember about condominium ownership? I want you to understand what the definition of condominium was: airspace in the unit, and you own the common areas as a tenant in common. Be able to compare that to a townhouse, which is different because of this. If you own a townhouse, you actually own the physical structure, including the exterior walls. Now, there's no doubt that townhouses typically joined dwellings. So in other words, there might be 8 townhouses in a row connected together. But if you were to take a forklift and take one of those townhouses out, it would actually have walls, it would have a roof, it would have land that you own. So in a townhouse form of ownership, well, here's an interesting thing to keep in mind. I don't know if they would test you on this or not. But in condominiums can be stacked one on top of each other. But townhouses cannot, because in townhouses, you have to own the ground that you're sitting in. You own the actual unit itself. It just happens to be attached to other units. And then importantly, the townhouse form of ownership, the common areas are owned by the homeowners association, which of course you're a voting member of the association, but the common areas, which include parking lots and entryways and swimming pools and stuff like that. But I actually own my walls, so I'm responsible for those. Co-op, very, very rare in North Carolina. So to us, it's simply a definition. Now, here's what's important about a co-op. If you own a co-op, you do not own any real property. So it doesn't have to follow real property rules. If you own a co-op, you own stock in a corporation that owns a building. And by virtue of that, you are given a proprietary lease. I don't think there's anything that I just said that's not in that little bullet point up there, my notes on that. I would suggest that you understand the concept of the board of directors, though, because that is unique to a co-op. Board of directors can approve or deny potential purchasers. Now, notice I said it can't violate fair housing laws, but the examples I gave you in class were President Nixon and Madonna were both denied the purchase of co-ops because they would have been disruptive to the community. Well, that's great if that's what you want. It's bad if you're a person that's trying to sell the co-op. You need to be aware that that board of directors is going to have some control about who can purchase the property. You don't own real property, you own stock. By virtue of that, you're given a proprietary lease to actually use one of the units. Co-op, not a big deal. To you, it's literally a level 1 definition. I'd probably give you $1 if it shows up on the exam. Okay. All right. So the tight little package there. Ownership in real property. When you go back and study these, do you understand how they relate to each other? Do you understand what happens when someone sells or when someone dies? And there's a very interesting question about joint tenancy, both in your textbook and also in the test, where it talks about, I'm going to go through it real quickly, but don't try to write it down. Just trust me that it's in your test stuff. Do you remember in joint tenancy, we had a question like A, B, and C own properties as joint tenants, A sells out to D. Well, D joins as a tenant in common. Why? Because he wasn't part of the original entity that owned the property. Then B dies, his property goes to C. Why? Because between B and C, there was survivorship. So now we have D and C owning the property as tenants in common because the original group is no longer there. I did not expect you to visualize that. What I did expect you to do is go back and look at those questions on your exams and make sure you understand that in regards to joint tenancy. That is by far the toughest question I can think of them asking you in regards to joint tenancy. Okay. All right. New chunk. Encumbrances to real property. Now remember, the word encumbrance means any burden on title to real property. There's no way you're not getting questions on encumbrances, okay? This is clearly a key point of real estate, is understanding encumbrances. All liens are encumbrances, but not all encumbrances are liens. So as we go through this first little section, we're talking about liens and how they encumber property. And then later we're going to talk about some other things that encumber property that don't fall into the category of liens. So here we go. Let's start off with liens. And here's what I have. A lien is a charge against title by contract. And basically what that means is you borrowed money from someone and they said, you know, you look like a nice person, but we want collateral. And so the lien is when they put a lien on your property, they're holding your property as collateral, and you agreed to that by contract. Okay. So when we talk about specific liens, this would be your mortgage or your deed of trust. I loaned you money. You agreed that if you don't pay me, I can sell your house and get my money that way. Real property taxes act as a specific lien. Now notice that in mortgage and real property taxes, they are specific only to the property that they encumber. So in other words, if I don't pay my tax bill for my house, then the tax office can eventually come and foreclose on my property and sell this house. They can't sell my other properties. The mortgage and real property taxes are specific to a property. That's all that they can encumber, okay? And then finally, mechanics liens. Well, it is a specific lien, so you've got it in the right category. But here again, well, first of all, if this comes up, it would have to come up on the North Carolina section because mechanics liens are different from state to state. So that means that if it comes up at all, you simply need to know our timeline. On the first midterm that I sent you, there are two great questions that go back to back on this that help you understand the mechanics lien. Because what you need to understand about mechanics lien is, first of all, who are they for? Well, they're for contractors who have done work on your property. And the reason that contractors need special protection is if someone's coming to build a porch on my back, on the back of my property, they're not going to finish tomorrow. It's going to take them weeks, maybe months, to finish my new porch on the back of my property. Well, they need to be protected from when they started that work, not when they finish it. Good gosh, if they started work and did it for 6 weeks, I could create a lot of liens in between then if they did not have protections. So remember, the contractor, if they have a right to record a lien, they can record it up to 120 days from the last day of delivery of goods and services. And if they record it within 120 days of the last day of delivery of goods and services, the priority goes all the way back to the first day. Why? That's the way we protect contractors, so that I couldn't go and create a lot of subsequent liens that would jump in front of theirs. So remember that timeline. So what do I want you to remember about mechanics liens? It's specific to that property where they did the work. It's for contractors who've done work on the property, and the law defines what these contractors are. You don't need to memorize that. But the timeline, 120 from the last day of delivery of goods and services to record. And contractor, if you do that, your priority will go all the way back to the first day of delivery of goods and services, which brings up another important comment. Matter of fact, you didn't think you were going to get tested today, but I'm actually going to test you on something real quick. So I'm getting ready to open up your mics. I thought I was. I hit unmute off. It says you're unmuted. I don't know if you are or not. Nikki, for some reason, it says I can't hear you. There you go. That's good. Okay. This is a big deal in the class. Lien priority is a big deal in the class. for the first one that can get it out of their mouth, what is the law that dictates lien priority in the state of North Carolina?
Honor Act.
Who said that? Nikki?
Mhm.
Good thing we unmuted your mic then. It is the Honor Act. And what does the Honor Act say about lien priority? Do you remember? First one. First one to record
Yeah.
has priority. When we call something a first mortgage, it's first, not because it's biggest and best. It's first because it was the first one to record. Is all this coming back to you? Okay. The Honor Act. But remember, there are, I don't know if you call them exceptions to the Honor Act or if you just call them unique things about the Honor Act. What is the first lien that is always paid according to the Honor Act? What's the first lien that's always paid in the event of a foreclosure sale?
Taxes.
Your real property taxes are the first lien that's always paid, right? Okay, now, having said that, there is something that's actually paid before the real property taxes, but it's not a lien. Do y'all remember at a foreclosure sale what the first thing that's paid is?
Is it
Fees.
The cost of the sale, the court fees and the attorneys. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And then, so the attorneys get paid, the court gets paid, real property taxes get paid, and then things start lining up in order of priority based on when they recorded, date and time of recordation, right? And then remember the mechanics lien. Mechanics liens have the ability to jump people in priority because they can go all the way back to the first day of delivery of goods and services. Your best resource for this is the midterm that I wrote that it has back-to-back examples of mechanics lien. At the end of the day, mechanics lien is probably a level 1 topic. You don't need to know that much about it. Okay? Questions, comments so far? We're just entering into this concept of liens. If there are no questions or comments, I'm going to put you all back on mute. Feel free to chime in if you need to. In regards to general liens, now, I tell this story every time I talk about general liens. General liens don't attach to a specific property, but general liens can actually attach to any property that you own. So the story that I always tell in class is about a student who called me back, and this was years ago, so I don't even know if they use the same question any longer or not. But he called me back and he said, Chris, I thought you said general liens do not attach to real property. I said, well, no, that's not actually what I said. What I said was they don't attach to a specific piece of real property. However, if you have a general lien against you and you own property where the lien is recorded, it'll attach everything. So let me give you an example of that, a judgment lien, okay? So I didn't pay for my credit cards. My credit card company eventually got tired of me not paying, and they took me to court, and they filed a lien against me. They won the case and filed a lien against me in Wake County, North Carolina. They have a right to attach any property that I own in Wake County just as soon as the case is recorded, okay? So general liens, not a specific property, but they could technically attach all your property. Falling into that category, if you don't pay your personal property taxes, same thing could happen. If you don't pay your federal, state, or your federal or your state income taxes, technically they can file a judgment against you and do the same thing as well, okay? Lien priority, I mentioned the Honor Act. There's no way that that's not going to be important somehow on the exam. Honor Act, what does it mean definitionally? Do you understand the significance of being the first one to record? And do you remember the minor exceptions, taxes, and mechanics lien? Very, very important, okay? Now remember, as I started into this section, I suggested to you that all liens are encumbrances, but then there's going to be a category of encumbrances that are not liens, and that's what this category is right here. Your restrictive covenants. Now, by the way, the thing that a lot of agents mess up on, or a lot of students mess up early on, is they simply they hear the word encumbrance and they automatically assume that it means something horrible. It doesn't necessarily mean something horrible. It just means that it's a burden on the title, an encumbrance on the title. I take restrictive covenants. When you call them restrictive covenants, it sounds kind of bad, but some people actually refer to them as protective covenants. In other words, if you'll follow these rules, it protects everybody's value, property value. So when we talk about restrictive or protective covenants, are they encumbrance? Yeah. I mean, if you're going to buy in my neighborhood, you have to agree to follow these rules. Are they bad? Not necessarily, because they keep the guy across the road from putting his VW microbus up on blocks and letting oil run out into the streets. So from that standpoint, I'm kind of okay with it. But they are an encumbrance. So now a couple of bullet points to remember about restrictive covenants. Not only are they an encumbrance, but they have to be recorded to be enforceable. Somebody can't just make up a bunch of rules and start holding the whole neighborhood to it. They have to be recorded. That way, if you want to buy in my neighborhood, you have the ability to go look them up and determine whether you want to be bound by those rules. Okay, slightly more important, but again, I don't know that this is a memorization thing. This is a recognition thing. So who enforces restrictive covenants? Well, when a subdivision was created, the only person there, or the only entity there, was the developer. So the developer will enforce restrictive covenants to start with. And let me tell you, developers don't love enforcing restrictive covenants. They're just doing it because there's nobody else there to do the job. At some point, the developer will turn the enforcement over to the HOA, the homeowners association. That's ideal, because now if I have a complaint against you, I can simply go to the HOA and say, hey, Charles is not painting his mailbox, or he's not mowing his grass, or something like that. The HOA will take care of it. That way I don't have to worry about a confrontation that way. So the developer could do it, HOA could do it, and I could actually do it as an individual. And now as an individual, I'm not going to go up to somebody's front door and punch them in the nose for not mowing their grass, but I can literally, I live here, you live here. If you're not following the rules, I can literally take you to court and get the courts to enforce our restrictive covenants. Now, I need you to be careful with that last statement here, okay? So let me explain this to you, and let me explain what a test question would look like on this topic. Restrictive covenants are private restrictions on the property. Now, here's the way we're going to try to trick you on the exam. In regards to private restrictions, they are enforced by private individuals or entities, developer, HOA, or homeowner, okay? In other words, if you see a question on the exam that says a violation of homeowner association could be taken care of by the building inspector, that is not true. The building inspector is a public employee. They do not enforce private restrictions. But did you notice what I said? If I end up having to file a lawsuit against someone else in the neighborhood because they are not abiding by the covenants, I can do that, and the courts will hear this particular case. That's what I meant by the courts will help me enforce this. Do not assume that there is public protections in regards to restrictive covenants, okay? Very, very important concept. And then let me tell you the other piece I have in there about homeowners. This came up from a question we had years ago as well. Homeowners, if I am bound by the same rules that another homeowner is, I can enforce against them, even if it doesn't affect me. The example I often use in class is when I'm out walking in my neighborhood, sometimes I could be a mile away from my house. And if someone's not taking care of their house, if they have a dog outside chained to a tree and I don't like it and it violates the restrictive covenants, even though it doesn't technically affect me because he's a mile away, but he's held to the same covenants I am. So I can enforce against him if necessary. And then finally, this question they love this. I have it underlined and I have an asterisk beside it. So make sure you understand this. Fortunately, it's not hard. In the event of a conflict between restrictive covenants and zoning, which one will rule? And the answer is whichever is most restrictive. A lot of people automatically assume if there's a conflict between restrictive covenants and the municipality, that municipality always wins. Well, no, remember, restrictive covenants can be more restrictive. They can't be less restrictive than zoning, but they can be more so. For example, the city would allow me to build an outbuilding storage shed in my backyard, but my restrictive covenants will not allow it, okay? So that's an example of when there's a conflict. The most restrictive would rule. You don't need to spend a lot of time on list pendings, but remember the rule here. If it's a vocabulary word, you need to know what it means and how to associate it. Even if it's not the answer to a question, it could be an off answer. So you need to know how to rule it out. So a list pendings is just simply a notice of pending litigation. It's a public recording that there's a lawsuit filed against a property. And hey, buyer, if you want to buy the property subject to the lawsuit, hey, that's fine. So for example, there's a situation right now where there's a subdivision that has a lawsuit against the developer. And here's what buyers need to know about that lawsuit. Eventually, if you're buying in that neighborhood, somebody's going to have to spend a ton of money to repair the roads. If they win the lawsuit against the developer will end up having to pay that money. If they lose it, each home is going to end up having to pay about $1,100 per lot to repair the roads, plus an additional amount to pay the attorneys that helped you lose the case in this particular case. So in other words, buyer, if you're okay with that, fine, go ahead and buy the property because it's on the public record, okay? If that worries you, what I'd recommend is you not buy a property in there until after the lawsuit settled. Okay, fair enough. It's a recorded document. Lis pendens, notice of pending litigation, okay? Continuing to talk about encumbrances, the word easements. Well, listen, there's no way you're not getting a test question about easements. It's a very, very important topic. So when we talk about easements, easements usually fall into two great categories: the easements in gross and the appurtenant easements. Easements in gross, if I want to go the easy way on this, I will tell you that easements in gross are most likely commercial easements. And look, I need you to really picture this in your mind because you'll understand that you see this all the time. So for example, if you're in a community and there are light lines, electrical lines in the neighborhood, high tension wires, that's an easement in gross. And probably in the benefit of my area, it would be Duke Energy, okay? They have an easement to cross my property. Duke Energy doesn't own property here, but they have a right to cross my property to get to other people's property so that they can sell their utility service. So those are examples of commercial easements in gross. Even if you can't see the power lines, they're buried in the ground. And if on the back of my property, there are utility lines that are buried in the ground, and therefore I can't use that. I can't go build a swimming pool on it because if Duke Power ever had to get there to work on their line, they have a right to get to that easement. Commercial easements in gross. They don't own property nearby, but they have a right to cross my property to get where they need to be, okay? Now, when you talk about an appurtenant easements, here's the short answer to that question. Appurtenant easements, there has to be two tracts of land. One piece of land benefiting the other. One dominant, one servient. If you'll remember this, I drew on the board a piece of land that had been subdivided. It had a front property and a back property. The front property fronted some highway. The back property didn't have legal access to a highway. So what the front property did was gave an easement, an appurtenant easement to get to the public right-of-way. Okay, two vocabulary words that go together. Why is it an easement? Because you have the right to cross the property of another to get to the public right-of-way. The definition of an easement is simply a non-possessory interest in the property of the other. I don't own it. I just have a legal right to cross your property. And what does appurtenant mean? It runs with the land. So when I sell my property, whatever right I had in that easement now becomes the property of whoever bought. It's now owned by whoever bought my property. They own the right to use that particular property. Now, here's a very, very technical point about the difference between an easement in gross and a appurtenant easement. In an easement in gross, there's actually only one parcel of land, and then there's an entity that has a right to cross the land. In an appurtenant easement, there has to be two properties, okay? And I don't know if that helps you visualize it or not, but I will tell you, regardless of whether you just got it right now, whether you get it from your notes or whether you get it from study and test questions, you need to understand the difference between those concepts. Easements in gross, easy. Commercial easements, hard. There's only one tract of land and then there's an entity. Appurtenant easements, two tracts of land, and the easement will run with the land. In this class, we talk a lot about creating something, and then we turn right around and tell you how to destroy it, okay? So let's first talk about how to create an appurtenant easement. The best way to create an appurtenant easement is simply to have it in writing, okay? You have it in writing, you have it recorded at the courthouse, at the Register of Deeds, and if that's the case, then if anybody ever needs to know when I sell my home in the future, hey Chris, do you have access to a public right-of-way? Not only do I have access, but it's recorded down at the Register of Deeds office so that you can show that to your bank and they'll understand that you're not landlocked. That is ideal, okay? Having said that, easements can be created by implication. And if I were you, the thing I would study about implication is landlocked properties. If I sell you a property that's landlocked, if I intentionally landlock you, you can say, well, Chris, that's not fair. And you could take me to court, and the courts would infer that if I sold you a landlocked property, I sold it to you, meaning that you could drive across my property to get to a public right of way. Okay. So in North Carolina, think landlocked properties. I'm not telling you there are no landlocked properties in North Carolina. I'm just telling you, you can't intentionally landlock another property, because if you do, the courts will infer that you meant to give them an easement on the property. So easements by implication. And then easements by prescription, very, very rare that you would get a question on this, but the definition is not difficult. You would obtain an easement by prescription through long-term adverse use. What do we mean by long-term? Greater than 20 years, okay? What do we mean by adverse use? You're crossing somebody else's property and you don't own it. And so that would be considered adverse. Anytime you're on somebody else's property that you don't own, it could be considered adverse use. 20 years using the property without permission, you may be able to find a prescriptive easement claim. I often tell my class, this never comes up. Literally last week in my office, someone brought me a piece of property, and they showed me how they had been accessing the property, and there was no deeded easement. This property, they have just been, they're landlocked, and they've been driving across this property for 37 years, best we can tell. And he said, what do you think the remedy is? When I sell this to a new buyer, how are they going to get to the public right of way? First of all, I said, go talk to an attorney. But secondly, they probably will be able to use this easement by prescription so that they can get it in writing that the buyer can use that and get it recorded at that point. Okay, easements by prescription. All right, easements. Yeah, you know, it's kind of a tight little package, but man, it's kind of a shotgun package too. They could go all over the place with easements. Differences between these two, specific examples of these two, how easements are created. So there's so many directions they could go with easements. Be prepared to be tested on easements. Look closely at your learn, test, pass stuff. Here's some good news. When you start talking about encroachments, you're absolutely going to get tested on, and you're absolutely going to get it right. These are the easiest questions that we ask. What is an encroachment? An unwanted intrusion from one property onto another. And then you just simply need to know some examples. So oftentimes people build their fences across the property line. Sometimes, because driveways can be built right up to the property line, you don't have to have a very wide margin of error before you're on somebody else's property. Improvements such as outbuildings, trees sometimes can become an issue as well. The thing I didn't put on the paper, which I do think you need to be familiar with, is what remedies are there in regards to encroachments? And here's what I mean by that. First of all, I'm going to open up the mics again, because I expect you to be able to answer this question. Oh, we lost Carly. She didn't tell me that she was leaving, but she appears to be gone. Okay. All right, I think your mics are open now. Nikki, you might want to check yours. Okay, so here comes the first question. Anybody can just shout it out. What's the best way, type of diligence for discovering encroachments?
Surveys.
Okay, I heard Nikki say survey, so she got that right. The way you discover encroachments is through a surveys. Now here comes the tougher part of the question. Now that we've discovered the survey, now we've discovered the encroachment, how are we going to deal with it? What are the remedies for an encroachment?
An easement.
Say again?
An easement agreement.
Yeah, well, it's technically an encroachment agreement, but yeah, the two parties could simply enter into an agreement that says, hey, I understand you're on my property and I ain't mad at you, but here's an agreement in writing that says you can use it, but it's still my property, which is basically an easement. We call it an encroachment agreement. What else? If it's a fence, what could we do?
Remove it.
We can move the fence. Yeah. Yeah. If it's a tree, we can cut down the tree if necessary. Could get into a lawsuit, and the lawsuit would be called, oh gosh, I wasn't prepared to talk about this today. What's the name of the lawsuit? An action to quiet title. You could enter into a quiet title lawsuit. That sounds to me a little bit of a stressful way of dealing with it, unless it's just a major encroachment. So in other words, what's my importance to you? This is a level 1 topic, but definition of encroachment, examples of encroachment. How do you discover encroachment surveys, and what are the remedies? Encroachment agreements, lawsuit to quiet title, and just you could contract, or you could sell me the piece of land if that I'm encroaching on if you wanted to. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So now we just finished that. Two little sections there. Encumbrances, liens was one section, and now we've talked about encumbrances that are not liens. List pendings, easements, encroachments, restrictive covenants, etc. Okay. Questions, comments so far? I'm going to fly through this, and the reason I'm flying through this is I talked about this just a moment ago. Property taxation and assessment. Don't forget all the vocabulary that goes along with property taxation. First of all, the Machinery Act. How often must you reevaluate property? Well, at least once every 8 years. How often could the tax rate change? Well, that could change every year. Okay. Oh, there is one point that's kind of important here. In regards to taxes, do you understand the difference between what taxes pay for and what special assessments pay for? So your taxes pay for, you can see a list of some of the ideas here of what your taxes pay for. Actually, no, I didn't put it on there. Well, so let's just talk it out. Your taxes pay for your local roads, your local government, your local schools. Notice what I keep saying, your local municipality. That's what your real property taxes pay for, right? Special assessments pay for one-time improvements. So for example, if I was recently annexed into the city and they're going to run us water and sewer lines, yay, thanks, they're running us water and sewer lines. Oh, by the way, they're charging us $12,000 for that. And special assessments are only charged to the people who will benefit. So the whole county's not paying for these water and sewer lines, only the people that benefit. Now, once we pay our special assessment, obviously we're still going to have to pay taxes for the infrastructure on the area. Another example would be area lights. The city brought us sidewalks and area lights. Boom, they could charge us a special assessment for that. Special assessments could also be used to describe if your homeowners association need to replace the roofs of a condominium complex or something like that. Any governing entity could apply a special assessment. So for your purposes, what was my point? Understand the difference between what taxes pay for and what special assessments pay for. Go back and check your notes on that. You probably have some great examples there as well. And I've also talked about the definition of mill rate. We mentioned that a little bit earlier as well. Okay. All right, let me stop there for just a moment. I think we just left chapter 2. I can't remember if that was chapter 2 and 3 or whether it was just chapter 2. A lot of information that we just went over there, but please break it down into little nuggets and ask yourself, what do I think they're going to ask us questions on this? And realistically, you're looking at maybe 4 questions on everything that we just went over. Questions or comments so far?
No.
No, you feeling good, Charles?
Yep.
You ready to take the exam?
Eventually.
Okay. And then have you completed your application yet? I don't think you were here when I was asking them earlier about the application.
No, I haven't done application yet.
Okay, let's go ahead and start getting that done now. And
Okay.
that way, by the time we finish going over our review, you're going to be ready to apply or ready to sign up for a time. And I was telling them earlier, the way that process works is you apply now using the information that you were sent by the office for the school. And
Okay.
it'll tell you what my instructor number was and the school number and stuff like that. You'll need it to fill out the application. Okay.
All right.
And currently they're booking after May 19th for classes with PSI. So once the commission tells you that you qualify, then what's going to happen is you individually will contact PSI and find out when they have tests available. My guess is that they are still going to do social distancing through, I don't know when. Okay. So they're not going to be able to use every monitor, which just simply means that it's probably going to take you longer to get a date to test. That's why I want you guys to go ahead and get out there and get in that queue so that you can set your text date. And then also just to remind you, Raleigh is not the only place that they do tests. If you go to other parts of the state, their waiting list is probably not quite as long. Okay.
Okay.
it's time to be considering these things. So let's get us not only test ready, but ask any questions you have that are going to relate to taking the actual test. All right.
All right.
Are y'all holding up strong for right now? Can I keep going? If I can go for another 30 minutes or so, since we didn't take a second break, then we'll probably get in what I meant to get into today. Hey,
Yep.
Jackie, I saw your hand. Were you asking a question, or were you just adjusting your camera?
Yeah, I just was putting my head on my hand.
Okay. So no new question at this point, right?
No.
Hey, Jackie, I'm worried about you today. You're not sick right now, are you?
I don't feel good, to be honest.
Oh, okay. Nothing to do with COVID. Just all days are not the best day, right?
Yeah.
Are you still working every day at your regular job?
Yeah, I'm over it. It's
Okay.
tough.
And Wednesdays and Fridays are still going to be okay for you to meet like this?
Yeah.
Okay, and we'll have you out by noon. So if any of you have anything that you're doing in the afternoons, hopefully going till noon will be sufficient, since we have 4, maybe 6. I mean, we may go one more week after the initial 4, okay? But remember, these I take seriously. The ones we were doing before, I could never actually take them seriously because there was not an end in sight. Now there's an end in sight. You guys are testing this month if you want to, okay? All right, new chapter here. Oh, by the way, this is extraordinarily easy, and it's probably worth maybe 1 point on the exam. So I'm not saying don't study it. I'm saying vocabulary, vocabulary, vocabulary. Ask yourself, do you understand what these words mean? And then move on. We're going to fly through this. If I'm going to sell you real property, the first thing I need to do is describe it in such a way that you can narrow it down to one property. So these are the methods of description that we have in North Carolina. The meets and bounds, sometimes referred to as distances and directions. And what I suggested to you in class is, can you recognize a meets and bounds description when you see it? It says, go that way 200 feet. Then once you hit a corner marker, you will turn and you will go back southeast or whatever it is for 200 more feet, okay? So if you can recognize a meets and bounds description, I don't expect you to be able to plat it out or to plot it out, just to be able to recognize it if you see it in writing. A little bit of vocabulary, point of beginning, to understand, I mean, well, this makes sense. To understand where you're going, you first of all must know where you start. And a point of beginning would be a well-defined starting point. That's all it is, okay? Monuments equals corner markers, and neither of them are that extravagant. It just simply tells you where the corner of that property is. The word call, C-A-L-L, just simply is a description of when it tells you where to turn and which way and how far to go. And then close, in relationship to meets and bounds, just simply means that all meets and bounds descriptions must end where they started, okay? And so meets and bounds descriptions, you as real estate agents are not doing these. Surveyors are doing these. You just need to recognize it. Then we get to reference to a recorded plat, or as I have written there, recoded. Obviously, it's supposed to be recorded plat. This is what, if you practice in the Wake County area, this is going to be the most common way that you're going to describe property. Why? Because most properties in this area have been platted. Most of them have been documented in some way that you could just simply refer to a map of the property. So in class, I actually pulled up mine, and it was lot 314, Holly Glen subdivision, blah, blah, blah. And if you were to go to the Register of Deeds in Wake County, you could look up Holly Glen subdivision. You could look at phase 3. You could look at lot 314, and it would narrow it down to one specific piece of property. There is no other property in the county that has that legal description. So therefore, it is not only legally acceptable, it's professionally acceptable, and it's probably the most common. Matter of fact, if I wanted to turn this into a test question, I would say it's the most common way of describing property in urban and suburban areas. Why? Because everything in urban and suburban areas has been platted, okay? And then finally, the reference to a previously recorded document. This just speaks to the fact that when you bought the property years ago, there was a legal description in there. So when I buy the property from you today, I can just refer back to that legal description. That is shown in deed such and such on page such and such from 1973 when you bought that property. Completely legally and professionally acceptable, and it's probably most common in rural areas where things have not been platted, okay? So reference to a previously recorded deed. If you remember the offer to purchase and contract, it actually has a spot for both recorded plat and recorded document. And what I tell people on the contract is more is better than less. Anything we can do to narrow it down to one specific property, including the actual street address. Now, I would not use the street address without these references, but the fact is a street address is part of your description of the property. Then we get into this weird thing, the government rectangle survey system. Years ago, I did not even teach this, and the reason I didn't teach it is because it's not used in North Carolina. However, because you now take a national exam, you need to be familiar with these vocabulary words. Again, you're not doing this. You simply need to recognize the words. The government rectangle survey system is based on plotting property based on its relationship to a graph. So when we talk about the graph, and actually I did a recording on this. Do y'all remember the YouTube page and the recording of the rectangular survey system? There has to be a baseline from a test standpoint. We're not going to draw much of this stuff out for you. So from a test standpoint, baselines run, what's that, east and west, okay? Meridians intersect baselines. They run north and south, of course. Township lines run parallel to the baseline every 6 miles. Range lines run parallel to the meridian every 6 miles, which create little chunks of land referred to as townships, which are 6 miles by 6 miles, okay? Still a large swath of land. So we break it down even farther into sections. There are 36 sections in a township, which probably should mean that each section is 1 square mile. Why? There's 36 square miles in a township, and there's 36 sections, so each section is 1 square mile. Importantly, there are 640 acres in each section, okay? So we finally got to something that's not only important but testable, so remember that. And then do you remember, once we got to sections, we started dividing it by quarters. We would divide it into quadrants or halves. Again, on the test, you're not doing this, but you have to recognize the way it narrows down a piece of property. First of all, it lands it on the right baseline, then it lands it in the right township, then it lands it in the right section, then it lands it in the correct quadrant of that section until we get down to whatever smaller unit you need to. I probably didn't talk a whole lot about check in class, but the concept of a check just simply means, look, if you lay down parallel grids on an oval, which the world is a sphere, it's going to cause some things to be out of shape. Well, what checks do is every 24 by 24 mile, it puts in an adjustment based on the curvature of the earth. It's, I couldn't teach you how to do it. I just need you to recognize that the word check goes along with rectangle survey system. What it does is it takes into consideration the curvature of the earth. Okay. All right. Very tight little package there. Methods of description. We use these in North Carolina, understand them. Government rectangle survey system, understand the vocabulary, move on. Okay. Slightly more important, next little section talks about transfer of title. I love the way that this is synthesized on here because it's very, very compact, but it's important. Transfer of title. When I get ready to transfer title, as I introduced this topic to you when we were coming through the class, I talked about the idea of you can transfer title dead or you can transfer title when you're alive. You can transfer title voluntarily. You can transfer it involuntarily. And as I look through each of one, I'm just simply asking myself, well, where does it fall within that continuum? So I look at this. If I'm transferring property by descent, well, here's the problem. You have to be dead to do this, okay? So I'm transferring property by descent and I'm leaving it to whoever. Now here's the word intestate. Anytime you see the word intestate, it simply means you died without a will. If it helps, you died without testamentary disposition. In means not, testate means will. So you died without a will. So who's my property going to if I don't have a will? Well, it's going to go to my heirs.
Yeah.
Go to my heirs if I have any, okay? And North Carolina has a law called the intestate succession law, and it describes who it's going to go to. Do I have heirs? Now, listen, this might not be an issue. If I own property as tenancy by the entirety, it doesn't matter that I didn't leave a will because my property is going to go to my surviving spouse anyway, right? But if I don't have a will, if I don't have a surviving spouse, the state has a law that says who it's going to go to. Do I have surviving brothers and sisters? Do I have kids? Do I have mom and dad? Blah, blah, blah. There's a law that deals with that. Okay. So one way I could convey property is just by descent. One way I could convey property is by will. Well, here's the bad news. You still have to be dead to get there. But at least in this case, you told who you wanted to. You died testate. You died with a will. Remember the vocabulary words that go along with this. Executor. Executor is the person appointed in the will to oversee the administration of the will. So there's two things going on there. One, you named who your executor is. If you don't do it, the courts will do it, okay? So you just go ahead and name who your executor is because you're writing a will. And then what does that person do? They oversee the administration of the will. They're the ones that are going to have to deal with your devisees on what they get, what you left them, et cetera, et cetera. If you ever want to do a dirty trick on someone, name them an executor of your will. Nobody wants to be an executor. It's a pain. Probate is the judicial determination of the validity of the will. Now, let's talk about why this is important. Just because you left a will does not mean it's valid. So, for example, if I'm married and I die and I want to leave my property to my mistress, well, that's probably a violation of either tenancy by the entirety or the marital rights statutes. So what the courts would do is they'd look at that and they'd say, well, that's not valid. They're not saying the whole will's not valid. They're saying that specific thing is not valid. So wills are public documents, and the courts would actually determine whether they're valid or not. Wills are presumed to be valid, by the way, but if for some reason they break a law, then that would not be valid. In regards to these two words, I don't know how big a deal they are anymore. I would still learn them because they're not hard to learn. A devise in your will, if you left real property, it's considered a devise. If you left personal property, it's considered a bequest. This next statement is probably more confusing than what it needs to be, but I'll say it anyway. I've been told that they actually just simply use the word bequest on the state exam now. In other words, they don't differentiate between a devise and a bequest. I don't know if that's true or not, but here's what I do know that that means. They will never test these two against each other. In other words, in the context of the question, you'll understand what it is, and they will not test these two against each other. In transferring title, hey, here's a good idea. Here's a good way to transfer title by voluntary alienation, which means that I chose who I'm selling it to, and you gave me, matter of fact, voluntary alienation, a lot of people just simply say it's consummation of a contract. You want to buy my property, I want to sell your property, you gave me money, and I gave you the deed. Voluntary alienation. That's the best way to convey property. And then finally, the one that makes the best test question is transferred by involuntary alienation. Now, why does this make a good test question? Well, it brings up vocabulary words that we need to know, and it also has 3 bullet points. And anytime we have 3 bullet points, it makes it easy for us to write a test question. So, involuntary alienation. My property was transferred. I didn't want it to be, but for some reason it was. Example, foreclosure. I didn't pay my mortgage, so the bank took it and sold it, right? I didn't want them to, but they did because I wasn't paying them. Eminent domain. I didn't want to lose the property, but the fact is the government needed it for a public project, so they took it from me. It's involuntary transfer of title, involuntary alienation, okay? And then adverse possession. Now, adverse possession, I didn't want to lose my property, but someone actually sat on that property for a long enough period of time that they were actually able to claim that they had a right in that property. They took me to court and they won the adverse possession claim. Now, I want you to notice how many stars there are. I don't think adverse possession in the field is that important, but it makes a great exam question, okay? So I need you to take a look at these and see if you remember all of this from the class. Adverse possession is the taking of property through long-term adverse use. So a couple of things that are important right there. If I lose an adverse possession claim, somebody literally took title to my property, okay? Not just the right to use it. They took title, adverse possession, through long-term adverse use. Well, long-term adverse use, in just a moment, we're going to describe that as being 20 years. So we know what long-term means. It means 20 plus years. The taking of property through long-term adverse use. If you're going to take my property, you need to do it in an open manner. Remember, we're going to spell out ocean here. Adverse possession, a successful adverse possession claim, the use of the property has to be open. It means it's not like you're sneaking on my property late at night. You are using the property openly. If I were going to turn this into a test question about open use of the property, I would set the test question up to say something like, you moved up to New York City, so you can't see that I'm using the property. Well, that's your fault. Okay, open doesn't mean that I have to make you aware that I'm using it. It means that I'm not hiding it from anybody. Continuous use. Here's another great one for a test question. The use has to be continuous. It's not like I can use the property for 3 months now and then next year come back and use it for a couple of months and then a couple of years later use it. I need to be using this continuously. There's some great test questions that have to deal with someone farming property, which is not theirs. And if someone's farming property that is not theirs and they're doing it every year on a rotating crop basis or something like that, that's fine. They can take that property. But if they do it a couple of years and then they wait 5 years and then they do it again, they're never going to take the property that way because the use was not continuous. Okay. And again, don't do your attorney arguments on me on this. It's not that time. I promise you, if there's an adverse possession claim in reality, there's going to be a lot of attorneys involved on that. Taking somebody else's property is a difficult thing to do. But for test purposes, it's relatively easy. Was it open? Was it continuous? Was it exclusive? In other words, I'm using it just for myself or my family. It's not for the public use. Adverse, I don't own the property and I'm on somebody else's property. I'm technically a trespasser is what I am. And notorious technically means the same thing as open, right? 20 years is the general statute. I do need you to put a star beside this though. I need you to understand the difference in adverse possession between the 20-year statute and the 7-year statute. You can make a claim of adverse possession after only 7 years if you're making that claim under color of title. Color of title is hard to explain in this format, but we spent some time talking about it when we came through the class. Color of title means I'm acting like I own the property. The reason I'm acting like I own the property is because I actually think I own the property. The reason I think I actually own the property is because I have a legal document that says I own the property. Turns out that the legal document was defective. Okay. Well, if that's the case, I don't have to have full 20 years. I could do it I could make an adverse possession claim in as little as 7 years. And then finally, we mentioned this a little bit earlier, suit to quiet title. Any question that has to do with what type of case would be involved to settle title disputes, they're talking about a suit to quiet title. That's actually going to be simple if you see that come up. Okay, so now, tight little package here for you to study together. Transfer of title, you're not getting a lot of questions. Dead or alive, vocabulary going with each one of these. Adverse possession, I would study that because that's always good for a test question, okay? Questions or comments on transfer of title? Okay, I like that. Let's see if we can get in essential elements of a valid deed. Essential elements of a valid deed. Now, I'm not one of those instructors that believes that you need to spend a whole lot of time making the list. I mean, to be honest with you, we're going to put all these things in a question. I mean, if we write a question on this, you're going to have A, B, C, D choices. You never have to come up with them off the top of your head. I'm more concerned about you understanding what each of them mean and why they're requirement. So for a deed to be valid, it must have the following conditions. It must be in writing. Now, notice that beside that, I put the statute of frauds. Statute of frauds is going to be an important topic. So you need to make sure that you understand what the statute of frauds means. And here's what it means. Statute of frauds says contracts to convey an interest in real property must be in writing to be enforceable. Well, what is a deed? A deed transfers the property from me to you. So it is a contract for the conveyance of real property. That's why a deed has to be in writing. Okay. A deed has to have a valid legal description. Well, that makes sense. That makes sense. Because if I'm going to convey something to you, we need to describe what it is I'm conveying. So not only does it make sense, but let's work backwards from there. Oftentimes I will ask students when I'm teaching, I'll say, where's the best place to get a legal description of this property? And they'll say, well, I can go online and I can get it, blah, 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 which is all true for the most part. If you want a good legal description, go to the deed, because I just told you there has to be a valid legal description there. So if you're looking for a legal description, go get the deed. It'll tell you the legal description of the property. There have to be operative words of conveyance. Now, this is more attorney speak than anything else, so I'm not too worried about this. The operative words of conveyance are something like the grantor in fee simple does grant, bargain, sell, or convey the property. It's nothing more fancy than that. All right, this is important. Who has to sign the deed? The deed has to be signed by the grantor. The deed doesn't have to be signed by the grantee. So the grantor, remember the OR, the person who's always given is the OR. So the seller has to sign the deed, not the buyer. And then a deed must be delivered and accepted during life for it to be valid. Those are the essential elements. But here comes the tricky part of this. Here's the tricky part. I bet you're more likely to be tested on the non-essential elements than you are on the essential elements. And here's what I mean by this. Do you remember from class that a deed does not have to be recorded to be valid? A deed does not have to be recorded to be valid. Now, I highly recommend that you record your deed because of the Connor Act. But having said that, there's no requirement by law that a deed be recorded, okay? And when you see the word acknowledged, just simply, that means that it has to be, that acknowledgement means notarized. A deed does not have to be acknowledged to be valid, but a deed does have to be acknowledged to be recorded. So you got these little tricky things that come up by here. Essential elements of a valid deed, but realistically, understand the non-essential elements of a deed, okay? All right. I'm going to go ahead and wrap on that. When we start on Friday, we'll start with types of deeds, title assurance, land use controls. We most likely will get into agency on Friday. So we'll knock out these little chapters. We'll get into agency and contracts on Friday. Now, before we go, okay, let's see. I've got the remaining of you. And I will send it. We're still going to keep working off of this. If you want to if it works for you to download and print on it, that's fine. But if not, just use the same PDF that we have here. The question is, let's see, Jackie, come back into the picture real quick.
Yeah.
Okay. How effective is this manner of review for you? Is it working for you? Are you getting a chance to make notes or getting a chance to ask questions about the gaps?
Yeah. I mean, I almost think 2 hours at a time might be better, but yeah, it's fine. It's helpful. And because it's not brand new information. It's just going over stuff we've already gone over.
Okay. Let's stay on 3 hours for right now, but notice I'm breaking today after about 2.5. So I get that. 3 hours is my breaking point on Zoom because I have one class that I teach that's 4 hours, and the 4th hour is just miserable to me. The first 3 hours I'm actually okay on. I do actually have the ability to play some games on this, and I don't know if you find that to be a helpful way of studying or not. We could put time limits on it, but if any of you have ever played Kahoot, it's a way of asking questions and putting a little pressure on you to answer. I'm going to experiment with that on Friday, so we'll do a little Kahoot game, and if you like it, fine. If you think it's a waste of time, we will eliminate it, okay? So we'll try to break up the monotony a little bit on Friday by doing that. Do you have any other suggestions of what you would like to see? And this is for everybody. Anything that you'd like to see or have me incorporate as we continue to study?
No, this is good.
Okay. Hey, as long as it's working, it's good. If it's working plus time, that's a successful formula to me. So if you come up with any ideas, just let me know. But for today, I'm going to say that we actually, I feel good about what we accomplished. I need to get the other people here, and I know that you're in a state of trying to figure out what to do with this information. But as we do these more often, you'll get more in the flow of it, and it'll feel more like school at that point. But for today, you are free to go. I'm going to stay online for about 2 minutes. So if you will dismiss yourself, that's fine. If you have a question for me, feel free to stay, and I will be online for a couple of minutes. You can ask me.
Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you very much. You too.
Oh.